everyone. Welcome to Wind Down Wednesdays. I'm your host, Paula Taylor, and this is episode 176. So today we are going to be talking about spiritual practice and the 5D. So this topic came to me actually, poor community building and 5D just keeps getting pushed later because these topics are coming up that feel really topical, that feel really important in the moment. And community building is something that's always going to be important. So eventually we'll get to community and the 5D, I think. But today we're going to talk about spiritual practice in the 5D, specifically the importance of spiritual practice during this transition and the evolution of spiritual practice, how it's changing as we move into this 5D. So first, just briefly, let me talk about what's the 3D, what's the 5D. I've been talking about this topic for months now. The original show, What's the Deal with the 3D, 5D Timeline Split, goes into a lot of detail about this. But essentially, the 3D is kind of the old way of being, this all or nothing, either or, judgmental, hierarchical space. We are being invited to move beyond that, to expand beyond that into the 5D, which is the yes and, the all-inclusive, the unconditional love space. And this is a huge transition. This is a humanity-wide invitation. And with this, there are a lot of people awakening or being called into awakening work, into spiritual work, who've never been in that before, who've never been interested in it, who've never been called into it, who have not been practicing. And this morning, I saw a TikTok of this poor woman who essentially was in what we call spiritual psychosis. She had started this work of awakening her upper chakras, what people call opening the third eye. I don't particularly care for that term, but it's a term that's out there in the community, so I'll use it. So she had talked about how she had seen on TikTok ways to do this, and then she had been pulled into this kind of protocol for opening her third eye, for kind of awakening her intuitive gifts, essentially. And it had brought her into this space of pretty much like abject terror, of experiencing things she didn't understand, of feeling essentially haunted by negative energies. And the term for this in the spiritual community is called spiritual psychosis. This has been around for a long time. My mentor, Sherry Ford, talked about, she was an old hippie, and back when people in the West were first getting exposed to Kundalini yoga, they talked about the Kundalini rising, which is basically energy rising from the base of your spine, kind of opening these intuitive gifts, this connection to the universe. And she talked about people having, this is sort of a well-known thing, that people would have these sometimes spontaneous Kundalini awakenings, Kundalini rising experiences, and then they would go into essentially psychosis. And I want to talk about why this happens, because this is why spiritual practice is necessary, even more so as we're in this transition, because we are being gifted with an accelerated growth pattern right now. It might not feel like that. It might just feel like we're getting our butts kicked, and that's okay. But without a foundation of spiritual practice, these things are possible, things like spiritual psychosis. I have worked with people who, a lot of times people come to me and they want to awaken their intuitive gifts. And the very first thing we have to do before we get to any of that is nervous system retraining, is trauma healing, is embodiment. We have to be present in our bodies. We have to be grounded. We have to be connected to the energy of the earth before we open these intuitive gifts further. All of us have some access to them, some of us more than others, because we can get into these spaces that can be dangerous for us, mentally, emotionally, especially. And the reason I'm doing this topic is because I had an experience this week that illustrated the importance of spiritual practice. And then this morning I saw that video and I was like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to talk about this week. Because if it's being shown to me, it's being shown to me for a reason if I'm having this experience. So most of you maybe have been listening to the podcast, know a little bit about my background. I have been a massage and energy worker professionally for 21 years now. And I have been on my own spiritual healing path. Really, it started about 16, but I got more serious about it at about age 19. So I've been doing this work for a really long time. I have a very well-established spiritual practice that I do mostly regularly. I'm not perfect, nobody is. And I still have these scary moments during this awakening process. The difference is when that fear comes up, because that's what's happening when we have these huge shifts, it brings up these existential fears, these ego-driven fears about who am I and what am I here for and what's happening to me and what is the nature of reality, all of these really deep fears. If we don't have the tools to know how to deal with those fears, if we haven't done, like the people in the comments for this video were saying, you need to do shadow work, you need to do shadow work, you need to do shadow work. And yes, that's part of it, but you need to have tools. You need to have tools. A long time ago, I did a show called Spiritual Tool Building. In order to do spiritual excavation, in order to do an archaeological dig, you don't just use your hands. That's not precise enough, right? We need all these different tools. It's the same thing for spiritual excavation. So if you are even doing shadow work and your nervous system doesn't feel safe, you don't know how to access safety in your neurological physical system, it's not going to serve you. It's not going to serve the highest good. One of the reasons I am always over and over and over again, like a broken record, saying things about for the highest good is because that is telling the universe what your intention is. Sometimes people want to open their intuitive gifts and it's not for the highest good. It's for an ego-driven reason. It's for, something about feeling special or feeling powerful or feeling more in control of life. And so you can open those things. There are people out there very irresponsibly just giving sort of tips about how to do that. And if you don't have the foundation, if you don't have the spiritual practice in place to help support you as these higher centers open, absolutely it can lead you down a really scary path. And fear is part of the process. I'm going to tell a story about that for myself to illustrate this. And once again, I have been professionally working with energy work and doing spiritual practice. I've been doing spiritual practice since I was 19, pretty regularly. That's when I started doing Kundalini yoga. I've had lots of different practices, lots of different tools over the years. Those have evolved. Sound is one of my main practice tools now because I find it to be so powerful and easy to access, and everyone can access it because everyone has a voice. I have been practicing now for 25 plus years personally, and I have been working with other people professionally for 21 years. So I have a very good foundation of spiritual practice, and I understand the frustration and the impatience people have because they want to progress quickly. And I've used this analogy before, and believe me, I'm a very impatient person. That's actually been coming up a lot for me recently, especially when it comes to certain things. I'm very impatient. But with this spiritual growth process, with this awakening process, I have learned to be patient because that is the universe's way of protecting me. When I say for the highest good, I am putting a little bit of a limitation on things, but in a good way. I don't want to spontaneously open all of my intuitive gifts if it means that I end up totally non-functional as a person. The person in this video was saying she hasn't been able to hold down a job for 3 years. I felt so bad for her. I felt like there was a broader message there that I wanted to share, because when we set intention for the highest good, I get frustrated. I've been actually working on opening my upper chakras more this year, and I feel them sometimes open and then snap back shut, and it's frustrating. But then I remember being a very young child and being completely overwhelmed because I was so open, and I saw into other dimensions, and I heard light language all the time, and it made it very hard for me to function as a person. And so I intentionally shut down those gifts, not really consciously, but it was intentional, because I wanted to be able to function. And I recognize now, having done this work for 20 plus years, there is no shortcut here. We're being offered an accelerated timeline, but there's still no shortcut. The only way to safely and successfully integrate all of this awakening is to start with a solid foundation. And the analogy I always use here is music, because I have a degree in classical music. When people learn an instrument, especially as an adult, when you go to learn an instrument, it's very frustrating because, especially as an adult, you're fairly skilled at many other tasks. And then you sit down, let's say at the piano, and you're like, this happened years ago. My husband said, I want you to teach me piano. And I was like, okay. And so I got out my little beginner book, and, it has Mary Had a Little Lamb in it. And he said, well, I don't want to play that. I want to play Fur-Elise. And I was like, I can't even play Fur-Elise all the way through without practicing. And I'm a fair, intermediate-ish. Not a fantastic pianist by any means, but I'm an advanced beginner. I'm an intermediate. I'm advanced enough to teach basic beginning piano. And I understand that. I want to make beautiful music, but in order to make the beautiful music, you have to learn the fundamentals. You have to know what key is what on the piano. You can't play Fur-Elise unless you can read music, unless you're going to just learn it by ear, which if you're playing the whole thing, that's a lot to learn. So you might as well learn the language of music. It's learning a language. So you don't wake up one morning and just fluently speak another language. You have to work on it. You have to learn the fundamentals. You have to learn the grammar. You have to learn all of those things. And there is no shortcut to that. In order to be advanced at something, you have to start as a beginner. And those are very 3D terms, very hierarchical terms, but there is truth to that. In order to build, we have to have a foundation. I can't build a building without a foundation because the building will collapse or the building will sink. So as we are in this transition from 3D to 5D, spiritual practice is more important than it's ever been. And there's a lot of people who are waking up to this whole world of energy and quantum healing who are essentially beginners when it comes to this work. They've never done any spiritual work. They've never done any spiritual practice. And it is the absolute foundation that will allow you to open and awaken in a way that is integrated, in a way that is safe, in a way that allows you to continue to function as a person. I am a fairly down-to-earth person. Somebody told me, used the word the other day, practical, or I used the word practical spirituality or something like that. And that is one of the reasons I do this show, is because I want people to understand this work is accessible, but it is work. We're going to talk a little bit more about that word work here, because that is shifting. The way we do this work is shifting. There's an evolution of spiritual practice, but there has to be a practice. There has to be a foundation in order to build, in order to really utilize your intuitive gifts in a way that is safe, again, that is practical, that allows you to function in this 3D reality, in this physical plane. You've got to have a foundation in the physical plane, in the physical reality. You have to have some grounding. You have to have some rooting. You have to have done the trauma work, at least to an extent. It's never done. I get that, and that I will always say that. But there is a point at which you've got to do that excavation work, the spiritual excavation, before the awakening. There's a reason that my work was called spiritual integration for so long, because that is that work of tool building and excavation. Before we get to awakening, we've got to do a lot of that integration work. And the good news is there's a very accelerated timeline on offer right now. I had somebody in my office this week who I felt like did about 9 months of trauma healing work in a 1-hour session. And that's fantastic. But that's not the end of it. That's the other thing that people don't recognize, is that it is a practice, meaning this must be done on a regular basis in order to continue evolving. You can't just go and see someone once and have a big activation or have a big shift and then assume that magically everything in your life is going to change. You've got to keep doing your own work. It's one of the reasons that I always give people tools and things to work on or things to listen to or guided meditations, because the work I do with people can be a catalyst, but the real work is you. That's why I say this 3D to 5D. It's an internal shift. Absolutely, we need help with that. We need someone to help hold space for us. We need someone sometimes to point us in the right direction or to give us some of those tools. But the shift itself is internal. No one can do that for you. And it can be hard to hear for people sometimes that this does require practice. We're gonna talk a little bit more about the word work when we get to this evolution. Let me talk to you about what happened to me this week that sort of illustrates this point and led me to this discussion that we're having this week. So on Tuesday night, well, let me back up a little bit. The energy's been really intense. There's been a ton of energy coming in, followed by these like periods of integration, and then energy coming in, and then integration. This has been going on since last year. I mean, it's been going on longer than that, but the intensification of this has been going on since last year. And it just keeps getting more and more intense. It just keeps ratcheting up. We've been talking about that for a while. And the way to integrate that energy is through spiritual practice. Sometimes spiritual practice is rest. Resting and receiving is a huge thing that we have not really been very good at in our society. So that's why I'm using the word practice instead of work. We'll get more into that. But the energy, just this moon cycle has been the most intense so far. It has been really kicking people's butts. It was kicking my butt. I've talked about that, about just feeling, just needing a lot of rest, needing a lot of integration time. And so the other day, I think it was Tuesday night, it was interesting. I went to sleep and I slept better than I have in a while. It was like I closed my eyes at, I think it was about 11, and I woke up at 5:30 and I hadn't moved. I usually dream a lot and remember my dreams. If I was dreaming, I don't remember them. It was kind of like, it's almost like being under anesthesia. Like I just closed my eyes and then I opened them and it was like 6.5 hours later. And I was like, ooh, this is great. And so I got up to go to the bathroom. I came back with the intention of going back to sleep for a little while and then getting up, and I didn't want to get up at 5:30. I felt like I needed a little more sleep. When I got back into my room, all of this energy started coming in really, really, really intensely. And this has happened to me. I've talked about this before. For whatever reason, a lot of times it seems to happen in the middle of the night or in the very early morning. Maybe that's because that's when we have some space to accommodate it. And right away, I started having physical symptoms. And it's interesting. My husband's been having this GI stuff that's finally resolving. And I was telling him, I don't think you're sick. I don't think this is a virus. This is very energetic. It would like come and go. He'd be totally fine one day and then kind of having issues the next day and totally fine and having issues. And I've heard that from so many people. It's the nature of how this the energy comes in really strongly. It stirs stuff up and then we have to integrate. You can think of it kind of like, if there's a nice clear pond and somebody's like stirring up the bottom and then all of a sudden it's silty and we have to let all of that kind of settle, or in our case, a lot of times we're being asked to release things. And so this has been going on for a while. So this energy started coming in really strongly. And the first thing that happened was I started having really intense nausea. And I have a little bit of like a phobia of throwing up. It actually runs in my family. And it's gotten a little bit better over the years, but it's one of the most scary things to me bodily wise that could happen when I get sick, getting a runny nose, getting a sore throat, having lower GI stuff, like all of that is, not okay, but it's much less triggering for me than having nausea and thinking that I might throw up. So that's the first thing that happened. And right away, first of all, I was thinking about what had been going on with my husband, and I was like, okay, because I thought, oh, maybe he did have a virus and I'm getting it, but it's been a long time. And I knew it was energetic. I could feel the energy coming in. So right away I was like, okay, this is the same energy that's been coming in that's now kind of triggering me in this area of my body. Why does that happen? Usually because there's something that needs to be released there. There's something triggering there. There's something we need to look more closely at. So that's why sometimes energy comes in and people feel it in all different places, because it's just wherever your attention needs to be drawn to in this particular moment. So at first I had the physical sensation, and it was a little bit overwhelming, and I thought, oh, what's going on? But because I have a practice of spiritual excavation that I have been doing for years and years and years, right away it was like, well, what's underneath the physical? Because underneath the physical, there's almost always an emotional, energetic component. So I was like, okay, what's underneath this physical sensation that's really overwhelming? And it was fear. And one of the things that we're really being challenged with as we're being asked to completely change our way of being in the world. That is a huge shift out of that hierarchy, that judgmentalness, that either or, into this inclusivity, this yes and, this unconditional love. And in order to release judgment of others, we have to release judgment of ourselves. And we hold these judgments so strongly that for many of us, it feels like aspects of our personality. So this is an ego-threatening shift. So there's a lot of really deep fears coming up for people. Fears like, who am I? What am I here for? What is my purpose? Things like that. And I will tell you, the longer that you do this work, I still have things that I excavate from this lifetime, but I am working now much more on a cosmic scale. Past life stuff, I've worked through a lot of that stuff. Generational stuff, I've worked through a lot of that stuff. I'm actually working on a quantum scale. Other origin being, like, what else have I been besides human? I have been all these other types of beings, and how can I access that energy? Where am I holding trauma from those spaces? How can I release that? It's the same excavation work. It's just being done on a different scale, it feels like a much more expanded scale, like a quantum scale. And so I still have fears, and the existential fear that's been coming up for me right now is like, cosmically, I know exactly who I am. I know exactly where I came from. And like, I still have to pay rent. Like, what am I doing here? Like, if I know these big, broad kind of cosmic truths and I can access them, what am I doing here? I'm here to serve. And if I'm here to serve, why isn't it easier for me to serve? Like, why am I meeting resistance? Like, I want to serve people and there's things standing in the way and things like that. So there was these really deep existential fears coming up about like, what is the nature of reality? So many moments of unreality recently where I've actually like physically pinched myself because I'm like, am I dreaming? Is this a dream? And, having a hard time following conversations and things like that. All of that is going on as this energy shifts, and it's just going to get more intense. We are in the midst of, I was talking to somebody just yesterday about, we knew there was going to be this kind of split happening, this shift. We're in the middle of it. We're in it's just going to keep intensifying. It's kind of like a exponential curve where like we were building up speed and now we're kind of into that exponential space. And the great thing is there's the opportunity for exponential growth. But that also means that the shadow work we're doing, the fears that are coming up, there's an exponential growth in those as well. That is why a spiritual practice is so important. So I was lying in bed, having all these this like really uncomfortable physical symptoms. All this fear was coming up. And because I have a very strong spiritual practice, and I've been doing this for so many years, I was like, oh, I know what to do. This is just fear. It's just fear. I'm just going to let it be fear. I'm not going to resist it, because when we resist, there is that whole, I think it's Newton's, is it third law? I don't know. This idea of like a force will be met with an equal and opposite force. So if I meet the fear with resistance, with force, the fear is going to grow. And it was already fairly overwhelming. And so here's where we get into the evolution. How is this work changing? I had a conversation with someone yesterday about how this person and I have both been doing work for a really long time, working on ourselves. We work professionally with other people. And there's a little bit of like, all these people are starting to awaken, and they're starting to finally be like, there's a little bit of vindication in that. Like, oh, all this stuff you've been talking about for years, I feel it now. And it's like, yes, that's great. And it's amazing. And I'm here to help you. And also, where does that leave me? Where does that, like, what's next for those of us who've been doing this for a long time? Like, what's our evolution? Because some people are just being invited into this work. And this is where the evolution is coming in. So I was lying in bed. I was completely overwhelmed. I could feel the fear. And I was like, I know what to do with this. And it's a word that has been coming up over and over again recently in my work with other people. On the show, I've talked about it. It is softening. So the opposite of meeting my fear with resistance, meeting a force with an equal and opposite force that just requires, then think about if you ever played that old game where you sort of like push against someone with your hands and you explore a little bit, as I push more, if I push too hard, they'll fall over. If they push back, so, you're exploring this idea of kind of resistance, essentially. 3D spirituality even has been all about resistance. I need to fix myself. I even use that word, I need to release, I need to fix, there is this like resistance even in our languaging. I need to work. Work implies resistance. Work implies effort. There's a difference between effort and resistance. There's a difference between practice and work. These nuances might seem small, but they're increasingly important in the 5D. We really need discernment. We really need to recognize these micro shifts that actually ripple out and cause complete life-changing opportunities for us. So I was lying in bed. I was completely overwhelmed. There was all this fear coming up. And it was like, I know what to do with this. I need to soften. I'm just going to soften into the fear. I'm not going to fight the fear. I'm not going to run away from the fear. I'm going to let the fear just be there, and I'm going to soften. And so I started with this practice of softening that I've been doing. Not even in the area. I started at the base. I started at my foundation. I soften into my root. I soften into my sacral chakra or my sacral center. I soften into my solar plexus, my upper belly, which is where all these symptoms were. And as I moved up my body with this softening practice, the fear completely dissipated and it shifted to expansion. It shifted to awakening. And pretty soon, by the time I moved up and kind of got to that area that I was having all the symptoms, I started to feel those upper centers, those upper chakras opening. And all of this information was flooding in. And it was great. I wish it wasn't 5:30 in the morning. But it was a complete transformation of my experience. And the reason I was able to access that transformation, to take that fear and turn it into awakening, is because of my spiritual practice. Our spiritual practice is evolving now into this practice of softening. So we still need the fundamentals. We need nervous system retraining tools. We need ways to tell our body that it's safe. I still think sound is the most straightforward of those. Breath work, thymus taps and thumps. We do all of these things all the time. I've taught these. I have videos on TikTok about them as well. We need those tools. But we also are evolving out of this 3D mentality of fixing. I need to fix something. And into a 5D intention of softness. This has come up repeatedly with people I'm working with recently. This idea in martial arts about using someone else's momentum, sort of in martial arts, it's like using it against them, essentially. So like someone comes at you to attack you physically, like we're talking about, in studies of martial arts. You can think of something like boxing as the 3D. I'm going to meet that with an equal and opposite force. They're punching me, I'm punching them. They're punching me, I'm punching them. There is an incredible amount of work required for that. You have to be in really great shape. You have to be really conditioned, like cardiovascularly, to have the stamina to do that. And then in martial arts, the thing that comes to mind is like the original Karate Kid, because I grew up watching that. And you've got this short little guy, Mr. Miyagi, and these super buff teenagers. And, in this, he's supposed to be this little old man. And he easily can defeat them in a fight, and it's because he understands the mechanics of energy. So when someone comes at you in something like judo, let's say, So you could just step out of the way and they'll just go right past you, or, you assist slightly and pretty soon they're like lying on the mat. And of course, we're talking about the training of fighting, and that actually is, it's funny because it's the difference between work and resistance, meeting the force with an equal and opposite force, and softening. This is coming at me. That's what happened to me the other night. I'm in this no matter what I want. I can't turn it off. The energy's coming in. I'm having the symptoms. I can't stop the symptoms. I could fight the symptoms, but I know because of my spiritual practice that will actually intensify them. That will make them worse. If I try to ignore them, if I try to run away, if I try to resist them, all of that is that equal and opposite force. Running away, it'll just chase you and keep coming up. Meeting it will just intensify it. And so what am I left with? I'm left with presence, just being there and recognizing it and acknowledging it and softening. I'm in this experience. I can't change what's happening. So why not soften to it? Why not remind my body that it's safe through this softening practice? Yes, I feel uncomfortable physically. Yes, I'm having a lot of fear, and I'm safe. That is the 5D, the yes and. Yes, the energy is coming in and it's very intense and it's very overwhelming, and I am safe. Because through this spiritual practice, I have trained myself to know what to do to be safe. My system is now in a chronic state of safety rather than a chronic state of unsafety or dysregulation. I get dysregulated, absolutely. And then I have tools to get back into regulation. And the truth is that part of this 3D to 5D transition, I don't know, I'm having such a hard, I keep wanting to say transmission, is that it's not going to get any less intense. The energy is still coming in intensely. Whether we're in the moment of experiencing it or not, it comes in, there's a little bit of space, and then it comes in again. And it can feel very contracted. I was using the analogy with someone yesterday about those old school Play-Doh things where you would put a Play-Doh thing, you put a piece of Play-Doh in and you push this lever and then it pushes the Play-Doh out and it like makes a shape. We're the Play-Doh that's being pushed through these little holes. It's very intense. It's very uncomfortable. That is the fact of this. We cannot change what's happening energetically. So how do we accommodate that energy? Through surrender, through softness, through using these tools that we've been gathering hopefully for quite some time now, but it's never too late to start gathering those tools, to start retraining the nervous system. And again, we're being offered an accelerated pathway right now. And for those of us who've been on this path for a long time, because there's a little bit of a like, really? Because I've been doing this for 20-something years, and now somebody's going to do the same work I did in the last 5 years on nervous system retraining in an hour or, 2 days or whatever. I'm very happy for them, but there's part of me that's like, well, why have I been working so hard? And no work is ever wasted. I am where I am now because of everything that's led up to this time. And I have the opportunity here to evolve and expand even further. I have my foundation very well built. I know all of my piano fundamentals. I know how to read music. I've been practicing my scales for years and years and years. Now it's time to sit down and let my muscle memory play an amazing piano concerto. Now is the time to trust the process, to allow for flow, to have the flexibility to be in flow, and to just keep softening. And it sounds really simple, but it is antithetical. Man, it is the antithesis of everything we have been programmed into with the 3D. And going back a couple of episodes to this idea of embracing the feminine or embracing the dark feminine, that is the feminine. Softness, receptivity, rest, renewal. Our masculine has been out of balance for so long. We need the masculine. We need active, We need to be active and passive. We need a balance, right? But our masculine has been out of balance for so long. All we know is the resistance, is the action. And as we invite in more of this feminine energy of receptivity, this yin energy, this dark energy of softness, of yielding, that is seen as a weakness in our culture still, of surrender, never surrender, no pain, no gain. All of those things have not been serving us for a very long time. And the evolution of this spiritual practice is to bring back the balance of these feminine aspects of softness, of receptivity, of rest, of restoration, of renewal, to normalize these, to make these part of our society. Those of us who have had no choice about that for a long time, people with chronic illnesses and things like that, introverts, people with neurodivergence, we have known for a long time the power of rest and renewal, the power of saying no, the power of opting out to things. And it's time for everyone else to kind of catch up with that. And it's time for us to soften to our own judgments of ourselves. My husband and I made tentative plans to do something kind of active tonight. And yesterday he was saying, are we doing it or not? And I said, I don't know yet. I would like to wait and see how I feel. And even a few months ago, or like earlier this year, I would have been like, oh, I said I was going to do this, I'm just going to do it anyway. And this is something we're doing for fun, for pleasure. So why would I push myself into doing something for fun, in quotes, if I don't really want to do it, if it's not calling me in the moment? That's that flexibility, that's that flow. I was like, I'm going to allow myself to go through the day. He is at work today. So I was like, you might get home from work and just be like, it was a really crazy day and I'm tired. And I want that to be okay. I want us to begin, that leads into 5D community a little bit. It's time for us to start speaking out about what we need, about what serves us, because it gives the other person an opportunity to find that softness as well. So when I call in that softness and I say, I really would like to do that, but I don't want to feel pressure around it. I don't want to feel like we're forcing ourselves. So why don't we just both allow softness and space and grace? So let's say I'm like, yes, I really do want to go. And he comes home and he's like, I'm just really tired and I don't want to go. Then I need to do the internal work to maintain the softness, the intention that I set. Even if there's like some disappointment because I really did want to go, let's say. This is the evolution. This is the 3D to the 5D. This is how our practice changes. And the more we do the spiritual practices that help us build those fundamentals, the more we can go out into the world and apply those things. So you don't sit in a practice room for the rest of your life playing scales as a musician and never perform for anyone and never play music with other musicians. That would be a really solitary, lonely, isolated life. Absolutely, we practice the fundamentals alone or in small groups, but the society-wide shift comes when we start practicing these with other people, and it's really, 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 really uncomfortable to ask for what you need, to ask for softness in a space where we have been so conditioned to have that hardness, to have that action, to have that resistance. If I said I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. There's no space for that. Moving from that, that's the either or, the yes or no, the black or white, that's the 3D, to yes, I said I was going to do this. And in this moment, it doesn't feel like it serves the highest good. And also allowing the other person to have their reaction to that. They might be disappointed with us. They might be angry with us. They might be triggered in some way. And that's okay. It's all inclusive. It's all part of the experience. But for so long, we have been in these interdependent kind of patterns of reinforcing this idea of work and resistance and the masculine active, so that when you do, it can feel, it's revolutionary. It's becoming less so, which is really nice. But this softness is revolutionary. And we don't go into total softness and just become a pile of goo that never moves. That would be unbalanced in the opposite direction. So right now, the scale is tipped way over to that masculine energy. We've got to call in the feminine to shift it back to balance. And it is a balance. And anybody who's ever, I used to be a balance beam worker. That was my favorite event. I worked other events in gymnastics, but that was my favorite event. When you watch someone on the balance beam, like Simone Biles is a great example, she is solid. It looks like she's on the floor. There's barely a wobble visible. If you zoomed that camera in on her feet and her ankles, she is making constant micro adjustments. Balance is about flow. It's about fluidity. It's about recognizing that I'm off in this one direction and not overcorrecting. On the beam, a lot of falls that happen on the beam are due to overcorrection. Oh, I'm off a little bit this way, I better lean back this way, and then you end up falling the other direction. It is absolutely an art to have enough flow to maintain balance while still having the flexibility, because the rigidity is what causes the fall. Now I'm in a gymnastics analogy and we're just going with it. If you watch gymnastics and you listen to, not the announcer who's just there to be annoying, but the actual gymnast, the former gymnast, they will always point out things like her knees were locked when she landed on the beam. That's a recipe for disaster, because you need to have shock absorption and you need to have that right to left kind of micro balancing in order to appear solid. So from far away, the best beam workers have barely a wobble. From close up, everything is a micro adjustment. And that is the difference here. That is, the 3D is the rigidity, the 5D is the flexibility and the flow. And the balance is coming back to somewhere. We're never going to be at a complete steady balance. It doesn't exist. There's always going to be a little bit of back and forth. There's going to be micro adjustments. But in order to get back to where the scale's even close to being balanced, we need to call in this softness, this receptivity. So if you are enjoying the show, if you would like more tools to help you with your own spiritual practice, join our Spiritual Integration Sanctuary. You will get access to a weekly guided meditation activation that goes along with the podcast. You will get access to bonus episodes of the podcast, special events, special discounts, and the building of this community of negotiating this shift from 3D to 5D, which is not easy, but we need to have spaces to explore that feel like there's enough softness in them to provide safety. This softness is a revolution. And it requires time, it requires patience, it requires practice. But the practice itself can be soft, can be done with ease and flow and flexibility. Have a beautiful rest of your day or evening, and I will see you next week for Wind Down Wednesdays. No.